Good afternoon. It's always tough following lunch, but then they put us right before lunch, and I know everyone's, stomach is rumbling. I'll try to make it quick. We're going to be entertaining as much as you could be entertaining regarding email. And we've heard a lot about email, and just want a show of hands. Who here is part of an organization that has some sort of kind of secure email gateway or email security gateway? If you don't want to show your hand. It's not a good thing. Almost every organization is pretty much a standard security solution now. And what we're going to be talking about is a specific incident that Fernando and I and really the security community has been handling for the past few months. Is really around secure email gateway, specifically one vendor that we're in mind. But what we're going to try to do is take a step back and create these types of recommendations across the entire suite of email secure gateways. So I'll do a quick introduction of myself, actually, Fernando.
Yeah, so I'm Fernando Tomlinson. I go by Nando. I've been with Mandiant roughly 19 months, technical manager focused on incident response, pre-incident, post-incident. Prior to that, I was in the U.S. Army, had a couple of all expense paid vacations that somebody mentioned earlier to Afghanistan. But pretty much half of my career there was focused on incident response. Enjoyed giving back, so I'm an adjunct professor where I teach Python. I'll pass it back over to you.
Yep. My name is Nader Zaveri. I'm a senior manager with our incident response remediation team. So Fernando's team, they're focused on investigation, trying to figure out what the attacker is doing, the life cycle, what's happening, how the attacker get in. My team is really focused on understanding the incident and then trying to plug the holes the attacker was able to utilize, contain, remediate, and kick out the bad guys. So we handle both on-prem and cloud, and really just really focusing a lot, specifically my team, around the cloud. So really excited because this specific unique technique is both on-prem and cloud, regardless of your situation. We're going to kind of go through a quick little agenda. So we did the introductions. What I want to do is level set what we're talking. When we say secure email gateway or email secure gateway, what are we talking about? I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm going to go a quick little overview, and then Nando's going to kick it off to Nando. We're going to talk about this one specific CVE that then dovetailed into a bunch of incidents that we've been handling for the past few months. And we'll go through some timelines, some samples of how the emails came in, and what to look for, what are ways to defend against that, and then also some of the critical path and how the attacker utilized this email secure gateway to perform their bidding, and some of the different backdoor and post exploitation. And at the end, I'll walk through some remediation and containment. So these are hardening guides that should be implemented whether or not you have this specific email secure gateway vendor or not. So this is something, regardless of your situation, regardless of if you're using Proofpoint or Barracuda or Microsoft, you should be able to implement some of these in order to kind of secure your environment. Some housekeeping items. This is a standard text from us, and really it just says that we do dozens of incidents regarding a lot of these cases, and what we're going to try to do is obfuscate as much as possible, so we are not tying back to a single specific client. That's one of the reasons why they choose Mandiant, to like to keep things very close to our chest. So for the client confidentiality, we're going to obfuscate some information while still trying to convey the message as much as possible. So getting into level set next verbiage. When I say secure email gateway, email security gateway, I mean half dozen in the other and a dozen, six in the other hand. It's a appliance that is put in usually in front of your mail server to perform some security functions if an email to come in. Usually your MX record that is tied to your organization is actually pointing to that specific appliance. So if you're looking at mail flow coming from the outside, Bob sends an email, it's supposed to hit that appliance, that email secure gateway appliance first. After it does a security check, the MX record then forwards the email to your mailbox. You can have multiple things. Big vendors, of course, is going to be Proofpoint. If you have Microsoft 365, they have their own whatever name they're calling it now, ATP, ETP. So new name every other day. It's a whole job just to figure out the naming convention sometimes. And of course, Barracuda, and if you have Trellix, ETP, there's various different major players in this space. And really, when you're looking at a secure email gateway, you want to make sure that it's able to do some URL rewriting, able to do some sandboxing so they can detonate an attachment and hopefully be able to figure out if it has some sort of malware. You want to be able to have some post-delivery callbacks. So let's say we have an email that came in and we realized it went out. We need to be able to call that email back, be able to search throughout the inbox and delete these emails. Let's say we figured out, we did our investigation, this specific email that hit our servers, we had 1,000 emails hit our servers, and we know for sure this is a spam. How can we go into people's mailboxes and delete it proactively so people don't accidentally click it? And really, there's a lot of things that you can add on, making sure they have the data leak protection, ensuring DOP, there's social security numbers being sent, that's going to be obfuscated. There's different ways that you can, depending on the vendor and the robustness of their security solution, you'll be able to do that. But really, for the purposes of our talk, we're going to be focusing specifically on Barracuda email service and how was a threat actor able to piggyback off this Barracuda email service and really wreak havoc.
Yeah, so really moving forward with that, in the end, this ended up being ACV, a critical vulnerability. It was in the high nines in terms of criticality associated with it. It specifically impacts the Barracuda email security gateway, which is really the premise of what we're talking about here. And that vulnerability itself was command injection. So allowing the attacker to execute whatever command of their choosing on the system at the rights of whatever the actual appliance is running under, which is really, really huge and really, really bad from a blue team perspective. The vulnerability itself existed in the AV scanner. That AV scanner is MVAS. And really what that spelled out, a mail virus scanner, right? So MVAS for short. And as attachments would pass through the ESG, it would look to scan them. If it was compressed, it would expand the compressed file and then do scanning associated with whatever that item was. Well, the vulnerability is really based upon the tar file parsing logic. So tar files containing specific logic within them, when the MVAS would look to expand it and actually make the determination whether it was good or bad, that is where the exploitation actually took place. That's what the vulnerability set forth. As we move forward, I'll show you what that actually looks like. Now, within that specially crafted tar file, the attacker also tacked on whatever command, whatever action they wanted to have done, and then they were really off to the races. And again, this was published by Google, so you can see the CVE as well, but it is critical in nature. It's not something that should be taken lightly. In terms of really attribution, because that's really what we want to get to in the end, is who is this attributed to? Well, at Mandiant, we assess with very high confidence, one, that this was being done from an espionage perspective in support of the People's Republic of China. We tied this to a group that we call UNC 4841. It's an uncategorized cluster of activity. And then at some point, they will graduate into an APT or what have you. But nonetheless, we have observed that this threat actor is doing very broad and also targeted email collection from compromised ESG gateways. The threat actor itself or themselves has been looking for particular users within a domain that the ESG resides in, but also other domains that have been communicated with. So it's very mixed in that nature. Now, some of the nexus that we link back to China, if you will, is based upon a lot of duplication in terms of malware being used, how it's arrayed, the actual infrastructure, and TTPs. Some of this we could argue, well, other entities do it as well. However, there's a large grasp of evidence here, if you will, that helps aid our high assessment in terms of this.
And actually, one thing to kind of mention, he made a great point about what we consider an UNC or uncategorized group, being 4841 in this case. one thing when we are doing these threat actor attribution and just in general, when you are, not every time an incident is going to have an APT group attached, right? Not everyone is getting tackled by a massive APT group. And really, with the way we put these clusters together, so, a lot of times that we see a lot of organizations get premature in putting an APT, but really what we're starting to see is when we're putting these like numerical values, this might be something very novel. We may have some remnants to the PRC, but it's a fairly novel technique, which then is why you're not seeing us attribute it to an APT group. But that's something you'll notice when you're seeing stuff from Mandiant and Google, when it comes to UNC versus APT. We just graduated an APT group maybe about a couple of months ago, related to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Those are, when we get to those level, it's probably 10 years in the making before we get a chance to put that a specific APT number. Usually when you have a cluster of attacks like this is why we call it an categorized cluster. And now we're looking at the targeting. So one way we look at the way the threat actor is trying to get a hold in the environment is who are they targeting? That helps us in terms of the attribution. What we saw is it's, pretty, when you look at the regions, yes, North America is gonna have the lion's share. But then from APJ and EMEA was about 50, 25, 22, 24%. So essentially, of course, main clusters of targeting was happening at the Americas and North America region. That's usually the case, depending on unless the threat actor is really having a specific target for an EMEA region. And then what we're looking at also, we like to see is this cluster of attacks happening, targeting a government or non-government organization. And it allows us to, better gauge, and what we'll see later on is how they were able to utilize the different techniques to possibly get lateral movement in other organizations.
Right. So in reference to the timeline, there's a lot of information listed here. I'll really hit a couple of things that I think is incredibly important. Well, the first thing is the first instantiation or instance, or really evidence of this being exploited is back in October. Now, this didn't really come to light, until a couple of months ago. So there was a period of time where this threat actor was really operating, as free as they could be because it was unknown or anybody wasn't tracking that at that time. In December, roughly 60 days or just shy of 60 days later, was the first evidence that we've seen of of exfil associated with this threat actor. And then kind of fast forward a little bit more into May, this was post when all this stuff started to come to light. We started to see small pockets of lateral movement associated with this threat actor. Because at that point, well, things are starting to come to light, and now I need to kind of maintain access and start moving around beyond the actual ESG. Now, I can't say it enough, or we can't say it enough. Kudos to certainly the Barracuda Incident Response Team and other Mandiant Incident Response consultants that have responded thus far. So as you know, Mandiant was brought in to kind of help with that response. The Barracuda team actually identified that there was some anomalous traffic taking place, which was really good. And then over the next few days after that, we can see that the vulnerability was identified, a patch was released, and then more specifically, Barracuda actually deployed a remediation script to compromise ESGs that were sending telemetry back to them. Now, the threat actor is shortly after observed changing their TTPs, which certainly speaks to the sophistication associated with this threat actor, because the underlying operating system and makeup of an ESG isn't to be taken lightly. However, they were able to do this on the fly, do it very, very quickly, and do it in such a stealthy way that certainly speaks to the sophistication associated with it.
Yeah, and I think this kind of highlights the point of, in general, outside of this Barracuda incident, when you are having an incident, you want to, if you are going to perform remediation containment techniques, you want to ensure that you have a full scope of what the incident is happening. You don't want to prematurely perform remediation on a specific threat actor because of this very thing, right? Which is we've seen threat actors change their TTP. So now your investigation is now kind of starting from square one. With this specific case, with Barracuda having to perform the remediations, it's just really a testament to the way the threat actors are. They were embedded in these appliances, had their persistence already, and then we're changing to have additional persistence techniques. And here's some like sample emails. One thing to really note, the way the email was constructed, if you can see, some of them are just not very crafted very nicely, right? They're not meant to be a phishing email. The way the malware is once the tar file hits the ESG appliance, whether or not it hits your inbox, it's already being executed. That's the main thing to really take away. It's even when it's saying it's a .jpeg or .dat, at the end of the day, the headers are still a tar file. And really, you'll see, that's why I say emails aren't really that crafted with a lot of thoroughness. They're just wanting to hit the Barracuda appliance. Whether or not it hits your inbox, they didn't care because that still did their bidding with the specific tar file in mind.
Yeah. So, but one thing to note with this, right? We mentioned tar files. You'll note in the images, some of these aren't listed as tar files in terms of the extension. So it's all about the header of the file. At the core, these are still tar files regardless of what they're named. These are small tactics that they were doing to really make it a little bit more difficult should forensics come into play. The actual attack path associated with this, because really we're saying a lot, but from a visual standpoint, and our Mandiant brothers, if you will, they had a talk on this yesterday, a great talk. However, the threat actor, again, sends an email with this specially crafted tar file, doesn't have to end in a dark tar extension. The header of the file still needs to be an actual tar file itself. It's going to get processed by the ESG, specifically the Amavast, that AV component. That is where, that AV component is going to expand it. It's going to actually do analysis of it to make heads or tails, whether it's good or bad. And at that point, that is where the command injection takes place. Now, when the command injection takes place, the threat actor has been observed having the ability, or really incorporating code that would allow them to establish a reverse shell back to their infrastructure. Typically, that reverse shell would then be subsequently followed with them downloading an additional stage. And that additional stage is a piece of malware that we call C-Spy. And what C-Spy allows is it allows the system to actually, it allows for a PCAP filter to run on the system. So the attacker can send specially crafted emails, and as those emails pass by this PCAP filter, if they contain a magic packet, well, then it allows the attacker to then either execute arbitrary code and or have another follow-on reverse shell go to different infrastructure of sorts. So this is pretty much what we have seen throughout a number of engagements following this same TTP, the same methodology. Now, the tar file, we talked about kind of, it being expanded, some contents being in there, but what are these contents? Before you, we have kind of a snippet of it. Some of the strings within the file or the file name itself are rather long, so they've been truncated just for the space that we're dealing with. The main aspect that we want to really focus on within the tar file is going to be that first. That file that's going to begin with a single quote and a backtick, if you will. And that right there is what is actually exploiting the vulnerability, the processing, the understandability, the way that the Amavast module handles that file allows for that command injection to take place. Now, without it being truncated here, typically what is followed with that is going to be base 64 code. And we see that there. This is going to be strung together, followed by semicolons. So that way it could all be executed on one line, if you will. And then there's some slight obfuscation because after the base 64 is shown there and then saved to a variable, well, right after that, we see it being echoed and then being passed over to the bash shell for execution. Now, what follows out of that decoded base 64 code is going to be something like this, which has been seen several times, time after time. And that's essentially the attacker declaring set ID or set SID, where essentially they're going to instantiate a new session, detach it from that current terminal. So that way, if that terminal session that is running terminates for whatever reason, then their detached instance or instantiation still will continue to run. The other aspect associated with that is going to be MK FIFO. So this is where they're creating a named pipe to be able to receive that information and therefore make use of it. And then from that aspect, we'll note that they will pass it over to OpenSSL. OpenSSL is going to be on the system already, and this is going to create that connection back out to whatever the attacker has designated. In most cases, it's been observed to be an IP address. In other cases, it's been a domain. But nonetheless, this is going to connect in a quiet mode, and then that is going to allow that attacker to have that access. There have been several variants of malware observed throughout this campaign, and just to provide another vision. So really bringing it back. The tar file gets processed. We've noted C-SPY. That's going to be that PCAP filter that I mentioned. And we see that before us. There's another malware that we kind of seen in the earlier days as well that's been noted or dubbed by us to be called saltwater. So saltwater is going to also allow for a backdoor access on the machine, arbitrary code execution, upload, download. It also has the ability to proxy and tunnel. So we'll note a number of times where there was some slight lateral movement. A lot of that lateral movement, all that lateral movement is noted originating from the ESG. So they were utilizing something like saltwater to tunnel that communication through the ESG. And then the other one is going to be Seaside, right? So we'll talk about this in the next slide coming up, but essentially it too is going to be based upon SMTP, looking at the ELO, HELO commands or sessions that are going to be stood up via those protocols. Now, in the second phase, if you will, post Barracuda's remediation script and the threat actor changing their TTPs, what we note is they started deploying additional new malware that had not been observed previously, that being Skipjack, Seaside, and a lot of those capabilities are based upon the actual emails themselves, but then they have the ability to then pass over configurations to additional reverse shells that's going to be Whirlpool. Really what I'm highlighting here is that the attacker had several different ways for them ultimately to gain continuous access in the environment, but also ensure that their access was persistent on the system itself. But let's dive a little bit deeper into the actual malware. So C-SPY, a lot of times we would note that it was named Barracuda Mail Service on the ESG, but to be quite frank, we've observed it being named a number of things outside of that. Again, a PCAP filter, monitoring for a magic packet of sorts. So if you're doing analysis on this, or you're looking at a firewall that's just before the ESG and you're seeing this 25 traffic or particularly 587 traffic, it may be a little bit difficult for you off initial glance to be able to make the determination whether that's legitimate or illegitimate. But nonetheless, the magic pack is going to be the main aspect associated with that. Saltwater, you see a number of file names that we have observed, not an all-inclusive list. However, it's our standard run-of-the-mill backdoor, if you will, upload, download capability, arbitrary command execution. But again, having the ability to proxy and tunnel commands is going to be key. So it's running on the ESG. The attacker is able to trigger saltwater and then from there execute further commands on the ESG and or swim further downstream. That capability enables that. Seaside, so this is going to be based upon ELO and HELO. So when we talk about clients initiating connections, setting up that connection and or identifying themselves, that's where that's going to come in. But really what's going to be highlighted there is the actual elo commands are going to contain arguments that are then going to be passed over to reverse shells. So even if we identified a reverse shell that had an IP address hard coded, the attacker had the ability to shift infrastructure and change where those connections were going to on the fly based upon using a capability such as that. So post second phase, if you will, we did identify what we call C-SPY version 2. So same thing where it provided the same type of capability. The differences are the first aspect, the first instantiation of it did not require any authentication. So if you knew about it, if you knew how to interact with it, then you could absolutely do it. Now that this is starting to become highlighted and known amongst the community, the threat actors shifted it. So they added in authentication, they packed it utilizing something called UDX, if you're familiar with that. So that way it further obfuscated any analysis or whatever capability is associated with it. And then they attempted to remove the symbols within it. Again, all tactics to really make our job a little bit more difficult and ensure that we were not able to utilize observed, signatures, if you will, that we already identified previously. So Whirlpool noted it to be on the system in several different places, but it's a just standard reverse shell. But it by itself, well, it needed to actually have arguments or parameters supplied to it, right? The reverse shell, it does what it does, but what port is it connecting to? What IP address is it connecting to? Well, it's going to receive that information from other malware that we'll talk about here shortly. C-Spray being one of those items, a lot of the logic written on an ESG is going to be in Perl or Lua. There's other items as well, but those are two prevalent ones that we observed. And what C-Spray essentially did was it monitored for email coming in with attachments. And if the attachment contained OBT 075, then it would take that, do some decompiling, decoding, if you will, and then pass that that decoded attachment string, if you will, it would pass it over to the reverse shell. So this was another aspect that the attacker was using to really shape what IP address, what port they need to be connecting to on the fly, just sending emails with this information listed in there. Skipjack was another email method that they used to pass over additional configurations, if you will. So what Skipjack would do was it would have in the content ID header specific strings. And if the string was met, it would do a low-level decompiling, XORing, if you will, and then pass that information over as either attachment or, parameters to reverse shell, and or it could contain raw commands to execute. So maybe the attacker wanted to, grab a process list or a netstat. Well, they would have that information, send over an email, have it obfuscated as part of the content ID header. Skipjack would monitor for specific ID headers, decode it, and then execute it. And the attacker would either have it hard-coded to be able to send back or utilize another capability on the system to identify it. And then also what was identified in the later half of the analysis was the attacker started getting to the point where they were leveraging rootkits. So this rootkit we dubbed Sandbar. The main aspect associated with it was it looked for anything executing that began with bar and sought to hide it. Now, if you recall, C-Spy, a lot of times when we saw that, it was named Barracuda Mail Service. And then you have Sandbar that's looking for items that are executing that begin with bar. So the attacker in this latter half, was very agile and looking to certainly persist. Now, as they leveraged a lot of this malware, they were time stopping. They were also deleting things on the disk as well, all to really make our analysis much more difficult when we got to that point.
And what we saw is as a way for post persistence, what they did was they created a startup script. And this startup script is, as we noted, the Barracuda mail service. This is not a legitimate mail service from Barracuda. This is a faux mail service name. And what they were trying to do is put it in the initd RC file so it could be on reboot. And what they'll do is, so when the appliance reboots, it's added, it started. Another thing what we saw is he mentioned time stomping. And this is where we saw where they're trying to time stomp from a known file on the appliance to try to utilize that time. So if you were looking from a forensic standpoint, oh, that file's this specific service has been started for a while. And then what we noted as well is outside of them putting it for a reboot and startup when it does reboot, what we also saw is they then set SID to create the session so then they can start it right away outside of the terminal service. So that way they'll be able to start the session, the mail service right away, as well as if you were to reboot the appliance, it'll be added. What we saw as well is they also created a cron job, usually daily or hourly. I think with the various different clients, we saw different things. This specific example is doing it at a daily basis, but essentially doing the same things where they're creating that. And then you'll see us go to an open SSL, going to a specific IP or whatever specific infrastructure that they are hosting. What we saw from a lateral movement, and we did see lateral movement. So outside of the Barracuda ESG appliance, we did see with certain specific clients that they conducted lateral movement. What we saw is using like open source tools like FS-scan, where they're trying to catch any sort of open ports and ways to laterally move, especially from a remote access perspective, so they can get out of the environment and start performing and maintaining their persistence even further. We did see them brute force some AD credentials. We saw over 500 login attempts over some time. So it's kind of low and slow. I think they only were able to lock out like 10 different accounts, but they were really focusing on a certain set of users. They wanted to make sure they were getting the right set of users. And what we saw is after they got those set of users, their passwords, we saw them going within OWA, within Exchange, and saw them open up mailboxes and going throughout the different mails that they're really focusing on, which is, where we can see from a PRC standpoint and espionage perspective. Some of the data exfiltration, what we see is you'll see them kind of search specifically for the mail store, and then they'll have search because they have a certain set of users. They'll look for certain users that they're wanting to get mail for, but then they'll try to grep that and put that into a specific file called templates, and then they'll take that file, gzip it out, and after gzip that, they put in OpenSSL to kind of exfiltrate that data. So we saw that with certain clients, and something that we see the exfiltration happening. Save email and then gzip. And what I really want to do is highlight some of the architecture hardening recommendations. And this is when we are looking at this, when I was putting this talk together, I wanted to focus not just on Barracuda, because I think that if we just focus on one specific vendor, we're kind of losing the forest for the trees, right? And we want to, and this type of thing that is, same thing could happen at any other major vendor. What we want to do is there's certain levels of internal communication restrictions that we want to be able to say, this appliance should not be able to talk back internally over, let's say, SMB or SSH, things that we know for sure that a threat actor will utilize for remote access or for the ability to laterally move. WMI, HTTP, if you want to do HTTP, ensure that the north-south is available, but east-west we can block. So there's different ways we can internally ensure that, yes, we need this Barracuda appliance that has to be forward facing, it has to be public facing, but what we could do is restrict and harden the environment as much as possible, as well as have additional external communication behind the L7 firewall, and be able to also, who has the administrative access, you want to be able to have just an allow list, ensuring when you create these RBAC permissions, you're not just giving everyone the ability to log in. And then also ensuring that if you have a local thing, make sure you're rotating that at a constant place, and then ensuring that you can use service account restrictions, like if you have group policy, we want to be able to restrict that service account, maybe using GMSAs to be able to ensure that the service account is being rotated automatically with Active Directory. And one of the kind of final point, we put together this blog post in cooperation with Barracuda. We also, a lot of the hardenings that I mentioned is also detailed in like a 30-page guide that we put together on hardening, not only from Barracuda, but we talked about a lot of the generic hardening methods, and really wanted to give as much information. Just last week, CISA came out with a specific a bulletin. They reference our blog as well with some additional things. So as we are continuously going through this, this is not an incident that is done by any stretch of the imagination. I think we as an entire community are still trying to figure out what's happening, and to the extent. Really wanted to thank this was a concerted effort. I don't ever want you to think just me and Nando did all this. This is an effort of dozens and dozens of people within Mandiant who have worked on countless of hours and thousands of hours together to be able to put this presentation together. I really want to thank everybody in Mandiant, everybody in Google, and also the Barracuda team we've been working in cooperation with them throughout the entire process to ensuring that we are aligned with what they're saying and they're seeing what we're saying. And I know we're a little bit over time. We have time for questions.
There's a couple of them that are in Slack, but we're going to go to lunch real quick. Just keep everybody moving.
Sounds good.
Cool. Thank you guys very much.